At my son's engagement party, I handed him a plain envelope. He tore it open, glanced at what was inside, and laughed. Not the warm kind. The kind that travels around a room looking for company. "Mum," he said, loud enough for the whole backyard to hear, "is this a savings bond?" From 1987? His fiancée's mother, a woman who'd introduced herself 3 times as the Carolyn Voss of Oakville, leaned over and looked. She smiled the way people smile when they've already won something. "How sweet," she said. "Vintage." My son's fiancée, Daphne, didn't say anything. She just touched his arm and steered him toward the next group of guests, leaving me standing by the gift table with a glass of sparkling water and 38 years of my life in someone's waste pile. I didn't cry. I picked up my purse, said goodbye to the 2 people who noticed me leaving, and drove myself home to Sudbury. The next morning, I called my financial advisor and asked him to liquidate one of the GIC accounts. The teller who processed the transaction asked me 3 times if I was certain. Then she called her manager over, then his manager. The branch director ended up walking me personally to the private client office on the 2nd floor. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said, closing the door behind us, "you've held this account for 38 years. The current balance is $4,200,000. He paused. "Is there anything you'd like to tell us about why you're moving it today?" I thought about my son's laugh, about the word vintage. "Just housekeeping," I said. The savings bond had been in my sock drawer since 1987. I'd bought it the year my ex-husband left, the year I started cleaning hotel rooms at the Radisson in downtown Sudbury at 6 in the morning and answering phones at a dental office from 2 to 7 in the evening. My son was 4 years old. He used to sit in a cardboard box in the break room and draw on the back of appointment reminder cards while I covered the front desk. I bought that bond because I didn't know what else to do with the $200 I'd managed to save that January. It felt like the most serious thing I could do with money. Put it somewhere it couldn't be touched, somewhere it would just quietly grow while I wasn't looking. Turns out that's how I approach most things. I kept the double shifts until my son was in high school. By then, I'd bought our first property, a duplex on Lawrence Street that everyone told me was more trouble than it was worth. The foundation needed work. The previous owner had patched the roof with mismatched shingles. My coworkers at the hotel thought I was out of my mind. I fixed the foundation myself over 2 weekends with a library book and a rented jackhammer. Rented both units to young nurses from the hospital. The income covered the mortgage, then the property taxes, then enough left over to save for the next one. The next one was a 4-plex on Elm, then a small commercial space on Larch that I converted into 3 bachelor apartments, then a rental house in Azilda. I never told anyone, not my coworkers, not my neighbors, not my son. I just kept working and kept buying, quiet as compound interest. By the time my son graduated university, I owned 11 properties. By the time he got engaged, I owned 24. The engagement party was held at the Voss family summer place in Muskoka. Daphne's parents had made their money in commercial real estate, shopping centers, mostly in the GTA. And they made sure you knew it within the first 10 minutes of conversation. Her father, a man named Graham, had shaken my hand at the door and asked what I did. "Property management," I said. He nodded with the specific blankness of a person who has decided not to be interested. "Residential?" "Mostly, yes." "Small-scale stuff, then." He'd already turned away. I let it go. I was used to letting it go. What I wasn't prepared for was the envelope moment. I had planned to tell my son the truth that night. To sit with him privately and explain that I'd been holding money in trust for years, that the savings bond was just a symbol, that the real gift was something much larger. I'd even brought the summary document my accountant had put together. Clean columns, his name at the top. But there was no private moment. Daphne kept the evening on a schedule. Toasts, canapes, a slideshow of couple photos set to a playlist someone had clearly spent money on. My son stayed in the center of it all, laughing, comfortable, Graham Voss's hand on his shoulder like a stamp of approval. So I gave him the envelope with the rest of the gifts, and he laughed. "Before we go any further, have you ever given someone everything you had and watched them hold it like it was nothing? Leave a comment." I want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you're staying for the rest of this story, stay. Because what happened next took about 2 years and completely changed my family. I didn't go home and fall apart. I went home, made tea, and sat at my kitchen table with the folder my accountant had sent over last quarter. 24 properties, net equity just over $9 million. The savings bond, redeemed, it would have been worth approximately $4,000 and change. Not a fortune, but not nothing. 38 years of not nothing. I spread the papers out in front of me and thought about my son. Not the man at the party, but the boy in the cardboard box, drawing on appointment cards while I answered phones. He'd known we were tight. He'd never complained. Somewhere along the way, that boy had grown into a man who laughed at things that didn't look expensive. I wondered when that happened. I suspected I knew with whom. I didn't act impulsively. That's not how I'm built. I waited 2 weeks. Then I called my son and asked if we could meet for lunch. He said he was busy. The wedding planning was intense. Daphne's parents had a lot of opinions. Could we maybe do a quick call instead? We did the quick call. He apologized for the envelope thing. Briefly, efficiently, the way you apologize when you want the conversation to be over. I didn't mean it the way it sounded, Mom. It just caught me off guard. What were you expecting? I asked. A pause. I don't know. Something else. Something more. Another pause. I didn't say that. He hadn't. He hadn't needed to. I told him I understood, that I'd let it go, that I hoped the planning was going well. I hung up and called my accountant. I want to do a full review of the portfolio, I said, and I want to restructure the trust I set up for my son. Any particular reason? I thought about Carolyn Voss saying vintage with that smile. I want to understand all my options, I said, before I make any final decisions. The accountant's name was Brenda. She'd been doing my books for 19 years. She was the only person who knew the full picture. You're thinking about cutting him out, she said, because Brenda had 19 years of context. I'm thinking about restructuring, I said, which is a different thing. If you say so. She pulled up the files. What do you want to look at first? Everything. Over the next 6 weeks, Brenda and I went through every property, every account, every trust document. My son was the named beneficiary on a discretionary trust containing 4 of the properties, the original duplex on Lorne, the Elm fourplex, and 2 others I bought in the early 2000s. Combined value, just under $2 million. The trust was discretionary, which meant I had full control over distributions until my death. So nothing's been triggered, Brenda confirmed. He hasn't received anything yet. That's correct. And you're thinking about changing the beneficiary. I'm thinking about changing the purpose, I said, which might mean changing the beneficiary. Brenda put down her pen. Tell me what you're actually thinking, Marge. Sorry, Mrs. Aldridge. I told her to call me by my first name for 15 years and she still couldn't commit to it. I'm thinking, I said slowly, that I spent 40 years building something and I'd like it to do some good, whether or not my son is in a position to appreciate that. Brenda nodded once and picked her pen back up. I went home and started making phone calls. The wedding was in September at a restored heritage property in Niagara-on-the-Lake called Whitmore House. It was the kind of place that got written up in Toronto Life every other year. Stone exterior, original hardwood floors, a chef who trained somewhere in France. Daphne's parents had chosen it. My son had mentioned it twice with the specific reverence people use for things they feel they've been given access to. I attended alone. I wore a navy dress I bought at Reitman's and shoes I'd had resold twice. I sat in the 3rd row on my son's side. During the reception, Graham Voss gave a toast that ran 11 minutes and mentioned Daphne's childhood vacations 4 times. I counted. No one asked me to say anything. At the dinner, I was seated at a table near the kitchen with 2 of my son's university friends and their partners. Lovely people. Genuinely, people who talked to me like a person and refilled my water without being asked. My son stopped by for about 4 minutes during the cocktail hour. He hugged me and said I looked nice and moved on. I drove back to Sudbury the next morning. 6 days later, I got a call from the manager at Whitmore House. "Mrs. Aldridge," she said, "I wanted to let you know that we've processed the final payment on the venue booking. I'm reaching out because I want to confirm that you received the ownership transfer documents." I set down my coffee cup. "I'm sorry," from the original sale. "Last year, the property group that purchased Whitmore House, your name was on the title documents we have on file. LPA Holdings? LPA Holdings. My initials. My company." "Yes," I said carefully. "I have those documents. We just want to make sure everything's in order. We're doing a full records update. Congratulations, by the way. Your son's wedding was absolutely beautiful. The florals especially." I thanked her and hung up. My son had gotten married at the house I owned. I'd bought Whitmore House 14 months earlier through LPA Holdings, a numbered corporation I'd set up in 2009. I hadn't planned the timing to coincide with the wedding. I'd bought the property because the previous owner had let it deteriorate and the asking price was significantly below what the heritage designation and the Niagara Wine Country location warranted. My property manager, a woman named Suzanne, had been running it as an event venue ever since. I pulled up the financials on my laptop. The Voss family had paid $12,000 to rent Whitmore House for the weekend, $12,000 that had gone directly into my account. I closed the laptop and sat with that for a very long time. A week after the wedding, I drove to Toronto to have lunch with Brenda. We met at a diner on St. Clair that she'd been going to since the 90s, the kind of place with laminated menus and very good pie. "The Whitmore House thing," she said after I told her, "that's remarkable. It's a coincidence. Some coincidence." She stirred her coffee. "So, where are we at with the restructuring?" I told her what I'd decided. The trust properties, the duplex on Lorne, the Elm fourplex, the others. I was going to keep them, but I was changing the beneficiary, not to punish my son, not for revenge. I wanted to donate the rental income for the next 10 years to a housing nonprofit in Sudbury that I'd been following for a long time. They built affordable rental units for essential workers, nurses, healthcare aides, early childhood educators, people who couldn't afford market rent in a town where the mining industry had pushed housing prices up and wages hadn't followed. The properties themselves would pass to my son eventually. That hadn't changed. But the income, $20,000 a year, give or take, would go somewhere it could do immediate good. "And the savings bond?" Brenda asked. "Already redeemed," I said. "Donated to the same organization." Brenda looked at me over her reading glasses. "Have you told him?" she said. "Not yet." "When?" "When he's ready to hear it," I said. Which is not the same as when I'm ready to say it. My son called 11 times in the 2 months after the wedding. I answered 3 of them. The first time, he wanted to know if I'd gotten the thank you card they'd sent. I had. It was printed, with a signature that looked like it had been stamped. The second time, he called to say that Daphne's parents were helping them look at houses in Oakville, and he wanted my thoughts. I told him I thought he should figure out what he wanted before asking his in-laws to fund it. The call ended shortly after. The third time, he called from a number I didn't recognize. His voice was different. "Mom?" he said. "Something's happened." He sounded like the boy from the cardboard box, not the man at the party. "Tell me," I said. It came out in pieces. He'd been working at a marketing firm in Toronto for 6 years. Good salary, solid clients. He'd also been doing some consulting work on the side, contracts he'd arranged through a friend of Graham Voss's, a man who ran a small investment firm, except the consulting had turned out to be something the friend hadn't been entirely transparent about. The arrangement had been flagged by the Ontario Securities Commission. My son hadn't done anything criminal. He'd been paid for work he genuinely did. But his name was attached to a firm that was now under investigation, and the firm where he worked full-time had put him on administrative leave pending their own review. "I didn't know," he said. "I swear I didn't know what he was doing." "I believe you," I said. A long pause. "Do you?" "Yes." And I did. My son has many flaws. Dishonesty has never been one of them. Daphne's father. He started again. Graham introduced me to this guy. I think he knew. I think he knew there was something wrong with it, and he let me get involved anyway. I thought about Graham Voss shaking my hand at the door and deciding not to be interested. Small-scale stuff. "Have you gotten a lawyer?" I said. "I can't afford." "I'll cover it. Give me the name of the firm." "I'll call on Monday." Silence on his end, the kind that means someone is trying not to cry. "Why?" he finally said. "After the party, the envelope, 'Mum, I was terrible to you.'" "You were," I said. "You were embarrassing, and so was your fiancé's mother. And I drove home feeling like I was invisible at my own son's engagement party." He didn't say anything. "But you're my son," I said. "So I'm calling the lawyer on Monday. I want to be honest about something because this story would be easier to tell if I left this part out. When my son called that night, my first instinct wasn't warmth. It was something colder. It was the part of me that had driven home from Muskoka with that quiet hum of, they don't know, they have no idea, and had maybe nursed that feeling longer than I should have. I had to choose. Not between forgiving him or not. That wasn't really the choice. The choice was whether I was going to let him learn something or let him fall. I called the lawyer. But I didn't call to fix everything. I called because protection and accountability aren't the same thing, and I wanted him to have both. My son didn't lose his job. The OSC investigation focused on Graham Voss's associate. The charges were eventually laid against the associate alone, and my son's file was closed without binding. But it took 8 months. 8 months of administrative leave, of Daphne's father's tight-mouthed silences at family dinners, of my son learning, slowly, that the people he'd been trying to impress were not the people he thought they were. He called me more during those 8 months than he had in the previous 4 years. He asked about the properties once, carefully, like he was approaching something that might move. "Mom, can I ask you something? The Lorne Street duplex, the one you always talked about, are you still holding it?" "Yes," I said, "but I've redirected the income." A pause. "What do you mean?" So I told him, "Not everything at once. I'm not built for grand reveals." I told him about the housing nonprofit first, about the nurses and the ECEs who'd been on waiting lists for 2 years because nothing in Sudbury was affordable anymore, about the $230,000 a year that was going there now instead of sitting in a trust waiting for him to be ready for it. He was quiet for a moment. "For how long?" he said. 10 years. "And then?" "The properties passed to you as originally intended." Another long pause. "You didn't cut me out. I didn't cut you out. I thought after the party, I thought maybe I changed the purpose," I said. "Not the person." He called back the next day. He wanted to know if he could visit the properties, not to check on them, he said, just to see them, to understand what they were. I said yes. We walked the Lorne Street duplex on a Thursday in April. Snow was still on the ground. The foundation I'd fixed myself in 1989 was solid as ever, better than the one I'd poured beside it in the addition I'd built in 2003. My son walked through the ground floor unit slowly, looking at things I'd stopped seeing years ago. The original baseboards, the window I'd replaced 3 times, the back door that had been painted over so many times it didn't quite close flush anymore. "You fixed all this yourself?" he said. "Most of it. I hired out the electrical when I had to." He stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking out the window at the backyard. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I mean, I knew we didn't have much. I remember that, but I didn't know you were doing this." "I know you didn't." "Why didn't you tell me?" It's the question I'd been expecting. I'd thought about the answer for months. "Because I wanted you to grow up knowing that the work mattered," I said. "Not the money. The work. What it takes to build something." I paused. "And because I was afraid that if you knew about the money, you'd stop seeing the work." He turned away from the window. His face was difficult to read. "And did it work? Did I turn out the way you hoped?" I looked at my son, 51 now, gray starting at his temples, standing in the kitchen of the first thing I'd ever owned. "You're standing here, aren't you?" I said. Whitmore House is no longer an event venue. I made the decision last year. Suzanne and I had been talking for a while about what else the property could become. The heritage designation limited certain renovations, but didn't preclude residential conversion. I checked with the municipality. The building could support 12 units comfortably on the existing footprint. I'd already had preliminary conversations with the same nonprofit that was receiving the rental income from the Sudbury properties. 12 units of affordable housing in Niagara-on-the-Lake. For hospitality workers, agricultural workers, the people who made the wine country run and couldn't afford to live in it. My son came with me the day I signed the conversion agreement. He'd asked to. He stood beside me while Suzanne went through the plans, room by room, floor by floor. What had been the ballroom becoming two-bedroom units. What had been the bridal suite becoming a bachelor with an accessible bathroom. On the way home, he said, "I want to help." "With what?" I said. "With the properties. With all of it. I don't mean managing them. I know I don't know how yet, but I want to learn. If you'll teach me." I kept my eyes on the highway. We were passing Barrie, the lake flat and gray on our left. "Come to Sudbury next month," I said. "I'll introduce you to Brenda. We'll start with the numbers." He nodded. Didn't say anything else for a while. Then, "Mum, the engagement party, what I did with the envelope." A pause. "I'm sorry. Not the quick kind I gave you on the phone. The real kind. I know." "Have you forgiven me?" I thought about the question. The real version of it, not the easy version. I thought about driving home from Muskoka in the dark, about the savings bond floating, about 38 years of early mornings and library books and foundations poured by hand. "Yes," I said, "but forgiveness isn't the same as trust. Trust is what we're building now." He nodded again, looked out the window. "The Whitmore House thing," he said quietly. "You owned it. You owned the place where we got married." "I did. You never said anything." "You never asked what I did for a living," I said. "You told your future father-in-law I was in property management and then moved on to the next conversation." A long silence. "Small-scale stuff," he said softly, repeating Graham Boss's words. "Small-scale stuff," I agreed. The first units at Whitmore House opened in March. 12 families. A woman who'd been commuting 2 hours each way to her kitchen job. A couple, both working in elder care, who'd been sleeping in separate rooms at her parents' because it was the only space they could afford. A single father, a school caretaker who'd been on the Niagara affordable housing waitlist for 4 years. I went to the opening. I didn't give a speech. I walked through the building slowly, room by room, the same way my son had walked through the Lawrence Street duplex. He was there too. He'd driven down from Toronto. He stood near the back during the brief remarks from the nonprofit director, holding a cup of coffee, looking at the families moving through the space. Afterward, we walked the property together, out through the original stone archway, around the side where the old parking lot had been converted into a small courtyard with raised garden beds the residents could use. "The woman in Unit 4, he said. "She told me she's been on a wait list since her daughter was born. Her daughter is 7. "I know. I reviewed all the applications." He stopped walking. "You reviewed them yourself?" "I wanted to know who was moving in," I said. "Not just numbers, people." He looked at me for a moment, really looked, the way he hadn't at the engagement party or the wedding or any of the years in between. "Mom," he said. "I've been thinking about what you said." I've been thinking about what you said. About growing up knowing the work mattered." A pause. "I think I knew it once. I got distracted by the other thing, by what it was supposed to look like." I started walking again. "Most people do," I said. "The trick is figuring out which one you actually want to live with." He caught up. We walked the rest of the courtyard without talking, which is its own kind of language. That night, I drove back to Sudbury, my apartment. I've lived in the same 2-bedroom on Paris Street for 22 years, was quiet when I got home. I put the kettle on and sat at the kitchen table with the folder Brenda had updated last month. 26 properties now, 2 more acquired last year, both small multi-unit buildings in the Salty and Marie area, net equity just over $11 million. The GIC accounts that hadn't been touched in decades. The trust for my son, restructured and patient. I opened the folder to the page I'd flagged, savings bond purchase record. March 1987. $200. I'd kept a photocopy. Frame it, someone had suggested once. I never did. It lived in the folder with everything else because that's where it belonged, not on a wall, but in the middle of the work. I made my tea. My phone buzzed. A text from my son. Thanks for today. I'm coming to Sudbury next month. Remind me to ask Brenda about the tax structure on the trust. Also, I told Daphne about the properties, all of it. I set the phone down and looked at the window. Outside, the Sudbury night was cold and clear, the kind of cold that makes the stars hard and bright. I picked up the phone and typed back. What did she say? A pause. Then, she wants to know if she can come too, to meet Brenda. To learn. I sat with that for a moment. Then I typed, tell her to bring good boots. The Elm Street property needs the gutters checked before spring. 3 dots appeared. Then a laughing emoji. Then, we'll be there. I put the phone in my pocket and finished my tea. Outside, the stars didn't move. The city hummed its quiet northern hum. Somewhere on Lawrence Street, the furnace in a duplex I'd fixed with my own hands was keeping a family warm. That savings bond was never a spare change. It was the first brick in everything. And to anyone listening to this, if someone has ever looked at your work and seen nothing worth respecting, remember, the value was never in what it looked like. It was in what it built. Keep building. That's all. Just keep building. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, trying to figure out where the real lesson lives. Not the tidy version, the one where someone is humiliated, builds themselves up in secret, and then the truth comes out at just the right moment and everyone learns something clean and useful. That version is easier to tell, but it's not quite true. The truth is messier. I kept my silence for 40 years, partly out of principle and partly out of pride. I told myself I wanted my son to value work over wealth, and that was real. But there was also a part of me that held on to the secret, because being underestimated and then being right has its own quiet satisfaction. I'm not proud of that. I think it's important to say it. What I've come to understand is this: the choices we make in private build the world we live in publicly. Every morning, I went to that hotel at 6 a.m. Instead of stopping, every duplex I fixed with borrowed library books instead of walking away, every dollar I put somewhere it could grow quietly. Those weren't dramatic decisions. They didn't feel significant in the moment. They felt like the only reasonable thing to do on a Tuesday when the rent was due. But accumulated over decades, those small, unglamorous choices became something I couldn't have planned. That's how most things actually work. Not through grand gestures. Through Tuesday. My son didn't laugh at a savings bond at that engagement party. He laughed at a version of me he thought he understood. The woman who cleaned hotel rooms, who drove a reliable used car, who sat at the gift table near the kitchen. He built a story about who I was, and that story had a very low ceiling. Graham Voss had done the same thing within 30 seconds of shaking my hand. Small-scale stuff. People construct those stories quickly, and once they have them, they stop looking. What happened to my son with the OSC investigation? I don't think that was punishment for how he behaved at the party. Life isn't that tidy. But I do think it stripped away the scaffolding he'd been leaning on, the scaffolding Daphne's family had provided, the sense that certain doors were open to him because of who he knew and how things looked. When that fell apart, what was left was just him, uncertain, a little ashamed, calling his mother from a number she didn't recognize. And that version of him, I recognized immediately. That was the boy from the cardboard box. The question I keep returning to is the one he asked me on the drive back from Niagara. Did it work? Raising me the way you did? I didn't answer it directly then. I'm not sure I can now. I think the honest answer is partially, eventually, with significant detours, which might be the best any of us can hope for with the people we love. What I know is that Whitmore House is now home to 12 families who needed it. that the income from the Lorne Street duplex, the one I fixed with my own hands in the winter of 1989, is currently housing a nurse in Sudbury who's been on a wait list since her kids were small. That my son drove to Niagara to stand beside me when I signed the conversion papers and asked if he could come to Sudbury to learn the numbers. Those things happened because I kept going on the Tuesdays when stopping would have been easier. Not because I was exceptional. Because I was stubborn, and because I believe that work done honestly accumulates into something real, even when nobody's watching, especially when nobody's watching. That savings bond sat in a drawer for 38 years, $200 in 1987. It was never spare change. It was the first decision in a very long chain of decisions, and the chain is still going.